Cops pull over an elderly black woman, mocking her and treating her like she doesn't belong. They bully her relentlessly, not realizing the truth. They've just arrested their captain's mother. When her son walks into the precinct, their smug confidence turns to sheer panic. How far will this confrontation go? And what shocking secrets will it reveal about the system they serve? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the worn linoleum floor of May's Diner, a familiar spot on the quieter edges of the city. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air as regulars settled into their usual spots, creating a comfortable buzz of conversation that felt like a warm blanket on this crisp morning. Evelyn Jackson sat in her favorite corner booth, the leather seat cushion molded to her shape after years of faithful visits. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly styled, and her powder blue cardigan matched the calm dignity in her eyes as she scanned the morning paper. The waitress, Jenny, topped off her coffee cup with a genuine smile. "Thank you, dear," Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying the warmth that made her a beloved fixture at the diner. At the counter, Officer Darren Hayes stirred his coffee with unnecessary force, his badge catching the morning light. His younger partner, Kyle Rogers, sat beside him, his uniform still crisp and new compared to Darren's weathered one. Kyle's leg bounced nervously as he picked at his half-eaten breakfast. Darren's eyes narrowed as he noticed Evelyn. He leaned closer to Kyle, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that carried an edge of contempt. "Well, well. Look who's reading the paper in our neck of the woods." Kyle glanced over, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "Who is she?" "Someone who doesn't belong here," Darren muttered, his coffee forgotten. "What's she doing in this neighborhood anyway? Probably casing the place." Kyle's brow furrowed, but he nodded along, his eyes darting between his partner and Evelyn. The older woman was now leaving a generous tip under her coffee cup, her movements unhurried and graceful. "Have a blessed day, Jenny," Evelyn called out as she gathered her purse and newspaper. Darren's smirk grew as he watched her head toward the door. He elbowed Kyle, nearly knocking over his partner's orange juice. "Hey, rookie. What do you say we make sure our friend here isn't up to no good?" Kyle wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, hesitation flickering across his young face. "You think that's necessary?" "Trust me, kid. I can spot trouble a mile away." Darren threw some bills on the counter and stood up, adjusting his belt with an air of self-importance. "Let's go do our civic duty." They followed Evelyn to their patrol car, watching as she climbed into her well-maintained sedan. Darren's grin had an edge to it as he slid behind the wheel, Kyle settling into the passenger seat with visible unease. "Watch and learn, rookie. This is how we keep our streets safe." Darren pulled out onto the street, maintaining a casual distance behind Evelyn's car. The morning traffic thinned as Evelyn turned onto a quiet residential street lined with modest homes and mature oak trees. Darren's hand moved to the lights, flicking them on with practiced ease. In her rearview mirror, Evelyn saw the flash of red and blue, her shoulders tensing slightly even as her expression remained composed. As she pulled over, Darren parked behind her, his chuckle low and satisfied. Time to see what she's really doing here. He stepped out of the patrol car, motioning for Kyle to follow. "Come on, rookie. Let's show her how we handle suspicious behavior in our neighborhood." Evelyn watched them approach through her side mirror, her hands placed carefully on the steering wheel. With practiced calm, she lowered her window, though her eyes held a weary knowledge of what was to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet residential street as Evelyn's car came to a stop at Officer Darren's signal. Birds chirped in nearby maple trees, their peaceful songs a stark contrast to the tension unfolding below. Curious neighbors peeked through their curtains, some even stepping onto their porches to watch, whispering among themselves in the crisp morning air. "License and registration," Darren demanded, his hand resting casually on his belt as he approached Evelyn's window. His voice carried an edge of authority that seemed unnecessarily sharp for a routine traffic stop. The gleam of his badge caught the sunlight as he leaned down to peer into her car. Evelyn's hands moved slowly and deliberately as she reached for her purse. "Of course, officer," she replied, her voice steady despite the familiar weight of anxiety settling in her chest. She'd been through this before, too many times to count. The leather of her purse felt cool against her fingers as she carefully retrieved her documents. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" Darren asked, barely glancing at the documents she handed him. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." His tone suggested disbelief before she could even answer. "I live 3 blocks from here," Evelyn responded calmly, though her heart beat faster. "I was just returning from breakfast at May's Diner. I go there every Sunday morning." The remnants of coffee and warm conversation with her usual waitress still lingered in her mind. Officer Kyle shifted uncomfortably behind Darren, his younger partner's face showing traces of uncertainty. His uniform looked freshly pressed, almost too new. But when Darren scoffed at Evelyn's explanation, Kyle's expression hardened to match his superior's skepticism, though something in his eyes betrayed his discomfort. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," Darren ordered, adjusting his stance. "We need to search your car." "I respectfully decline," Evelyn stated firmly, her hands remaining visible on the steering wheel. The familiar leather was warm beneath her steady grip. "You have no probable cause for a search, officer." Darren's face reddened, a vein pulsing at his temple. "Ma'am, if you don't comply, I'll have to assume you're hiding something. Last chance, step out of the vehicle." His fingers drummed against his belt impatiently. "I know my rights," Evelyn replied, her voice never wavering. "I do not consent to a search." Years of similar encounters had taught her exactly how to handle these situations. "Kyle, call for backup," Darren barked, reaching for his handcuffs. The metal clinked ominously in the morning quiet. "Ma'am, you're resisting a lawful order." "That's right," Kyle added, though his voice cracked slightly. He fumbled with his radio, avoiding Evelyn's steady gaze. His inexperience showed in every uncertain movement. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived, their lights flashing silently in the morning sun. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath as Evelyn stood perfectly still, while Darren roughly handcuffed her, maintaining her dignity even as neighbors gathered to witness her humiliation. Her car was quickly surrounded by officers, their movements practiced and efficient, and a tow truck was called. The screech of its approaching tires broke the tense silence. As she watched her vehicle being impounded, Evelyn felt a deep sadness well up inside her. The sight of her car being hooked up to the tow truck struck her as a painful metaphor for the injustice of the situation. But she refused to let it show on her face, years of experience having taught her the importance of maintaining composure in these moments. The ride to the precinct was silent, with Evelyn sitting straight-backed in the patrol car's rear seat. Through the partition, she could see Kyle glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, his young face reflected in brief flashes while Darren stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight enough to make the muscles stand out. At the station, they led her to a stark holding room, where she sat with perfect posture, her handcuffed hands resting in her lap. The metal chair was cold and uncomfortable, but she remained dignified. Through the window, she could see the 2 officers conferring in low voices, their expressions uncertain as they cast furtive glances in her direction. Her unwavering calm seemed to unsettle them more than any protest could have, and she drew strength from that small victory. Captain Marcus Jackson sat at his desk, methodically reviewing the morning's incident reports. The precinct buzzed with its usual late-morning activity, phones ringing, officers chatting, and the constant shuffle of paperwork. The aroma of stale coffee lingered in the air as he rubbed his tired eyes. He looked up as Officer Thompson, a fresh-faced rookie with an eager-to-please demeanor, knocked on his open door. "Captain, sir," Thompson said, fidgeting slightly with the sleeve of his crisp uniform. "There's something you might want to look into. Officers Hayes and Rogers brought in an elderly woman about an hour ago. The booking seems unusual." Marcus frowned, his instincts instantly alert. His years of experience had taught him to trust these gut feelings. "Unusual how?" "Well, sir, the charges are vague. Something about resisting an officer, but there's no clear probable cause listed for the initial stop. The paperwork feels rushed." "Where is she now?" Marcus asked, already standing and straightening his badge. "Holding room 3, sir." Marcus strode through the precinct, his purposeful steps and commanding presence causing conversations to quiet as he passed. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor as he made his way down the corridor. He pushed open the door to holding room 3 and stopped dead in his tracks. There, sitting with perfect posture and an air of unmistakable dignity, was his mother, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "Mama," he whispered before his face hardened like granite. "Hayes, Rogers, get in here now." The 2 officers hurried in, their earlier swagger replaced by nervous tension as they realized their mistake. Darren's face had lost its usual smugness, his shoulders hunched defensively, while Kyle seemed to be trying to shrink into himself, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Explain yourselves," Marcus demanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Why is my mother in custody?" "Sir, we observed suspicious behavior," Darren began, his words trailing off weakly. "Marcus." Evelyn's calm voice cut through the tension like a knife. Her eyes, filled with wisdom and understanding, met his. "Remember who you are and what you stand for." Marcus took a deep breath, his hands clenched at his sides so tight his knuckles whitened. "You're right, Mama." He turned back to the officers, squaring his shoulders. "I want a full explanation. Now." We noticed her at the diner," Kyle stammered, his face flushed with shame. "Officer Hayes thought she seemed out of place in the neighborhood." "Out of place?" Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet, each word precisely measured. "There was also a broken taillight," Darren added quickly, sweat beading on his forehead. "When she refused a vehicle search—" "You had no probable cause for a search," Marcus interrupted, his words sharp as steel. "And I checked her car myself last week. There was no broken taillight." Evelyn spoke again, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "Marcus, handle this the right way. Not with anger, but with justice." Marcus looked at his mother, seeing the strength and wisdom in her eyes that had guided him throughout his life. The same eyes that had dried his childhood tears and celebrated his achievements. He straightened his shoulders, his rage transforming into cold determination. "Officers Hayes and Rogers, consider yourselves on administrative leave pending a full investigation of this incident. I will personally review every stop, every arrest, every complaint filed against both of you, every single one." The officers paled but remained silent, the weight of their actions finally settling on their shoulders. "Marcus," Evelyn said softly, her gentle tone carrying the weight of years of wisdom. "Do what needs to be done, but do it right." Marcus nodded, his jaw set with resolve as he prepared to leave the room and begin his investigation. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about every person who had ever faced similar treatment. Marcus sat at his desk, surrounded by towering stacks of papers and open files that threatened to topple over. His fingers drummed a restless rhythm against the worn wood as he read through Darren and Kyle's report of his mother's arrest. The more he read, the deeper his frown became, carving lines of concern into his forehead. "This doesn't add up," he muttered, comparing their written account to the initial booking details. They claimed she had been hostile and uncooperative, even aggressive during the arrest. But the booking officer's notes painted a completely different picture, describing her as calm and compliant throughout processing. With practiced efficiency born from years on the force, Marcus pulled their personnel files from the system. As he dug deeper into the records, a disturbing pattern emerged like an ugly stain spreading across fabric. Complaint after complaint filled their records: excessive force, racial profiling, harassment. Most had been dismissed with minimal investigation, often with the same supervising officers signing off on the dismissals with practiced indifference. 3 complaints last month alone, Marcus noted grimly, scanning Darren's file with growing disgust. He opened another folder, revealing similar issues with Kyle. The younger officer's record showed fewer incidents, but the same troubling behavior was there, especially when partnered with Darren. It was like watching a rookie being molded into exactly the kind of officer the department didn't need. In the bullpen outside his office, Darren and Kyle huddled near the water cooler like guilty schoolchildren, shooting furtive glances toward Marcus's door. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their worried faces. "He's been in there for hours," Kyle whispered nervously, his paper cup crumpling slightly in his trembling grip. Darren shrugged, taking a casual sip of water as if he didn't have a care in the world. Relax, kid. Lieutenant Price always has our backs. This'll blow over like everything else. His words carried a hint of practiced certainty that seemed to do little to calm Kyle's nerves. Marcus's jaw tightened as he discovered more connections, each new revelation making his blood pressure rise. The same names kept appearing: officers who covered for each other, supervisors who looked the other way. It wasn't just Darren and Kyle. They were part of a larger problem that had been festering in the department for years, spreading like a cancer through the ranks. He pressed the intercom button on his desk phone, his decision made. Send in officers Hayes and Rogers. The two officers entered his office, Darren strutting in with his usual cocky confidence, while Kyle trailed behind like a shadow, less sure of himself. The afternoon sun streaming through the blinds cast prison bar stripes across their faces. Effective immediately, you're both reassigned to desk duty pending a full review of your conduct, Marcus announced, his voice steady and firm as steel. Darren's trademark smirk faltered, cracking like a mask. Come on, Captain. Over one little misunderstanding? This is ridiculous. This isn't about one incident, Officer Hayes. I've reviewed your complete records and there are serious concerns that need to be addressed. Marcus's words fell like heavy stones in the quiet office. Kyle's face paled to a sickly shade as Marcus held up their thick files. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact as if the floor had suddenly become fascinating. You can't do this, Darren protested, his earlier confidence cracking like thin ice. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I can and I have dismissed. Marcus's tone left no room for argument. The officers left, Darren's shoulders stiff with barely contained anger, Kyle looking like he might be sick. Through his office window, Marcus watched them retreat to their desks, their whispered conversation now tinged with genuine worry and fear. The other officers in the bullpen pretended not to notice, but their sideways glances told a different story. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the holding room's small window, painting stark lines across the institutional gray walls. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating an unsettling contrast. Evelyn sat perfectly straight in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, emanating a quiet dignity that seemed to transform the stark room. Her weathered wedding ring caught the light, a reminder of the decades of wisdom she carried. Marcus entered, his jaw tight with barely contained anger, his police captain's badge glinting on his belt. Mom, I'm so sorry about all this. I'll have those officers. Marcus? Evelyn interrupted softly, her warm smile lighting up her face, the corners of her eyes crinkling with maternal affection. Come sit with me for a moment. He dropped into the chair across from her, running a hand over his face, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. I want you to press charges. What they did was completely unacceptable. They had no right. No, she said firmly, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used during his childhood tantrums. I want you to release me, and we'll handle this the right way. But Mom, listen to me, son. She reached across and took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring against his trembling fingers. I remember when you were just 10 years old, and Mr. Peterson from down the street accused you of breaking his window. You were so angry, ready to fight. Your little fists were balled up tight. But remember what I told you? Marcus nodded slowly, the memory washing over him. You said dignity speaks louder than anger. That's right, and I've lived by those words my whole life. She straightened her cardigan, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle, a habit she'd developed over years of presenting herself impeccably to a world that often judged too quickly. Back in '82, I was followed around Caldwell's department store by a security guard who was certain I was stealing. He searched my purse, made a scene in front of everyone. The other shoppers stared and whispered. I could have yelled, could have fought back. Instead, I stood tall, showed him every receipt, and walked out with my head high. The next week, I wrote a letter to the store owner. That guard was fired, and they changed their security policies. Marcus listened intently, his expression softening as understanding dawned in his dark eyes. You never told me that story, Because it wasn't about that one guard or that one store. It was about changing the system, not just punishing individuals. She squeezed his hand, her grip still strong despite her years. These officers need to face consequences, yes, but through proper channels. Not because they arrested your mother, but because what they did was wrong. Period. That's how real change happens. Marcus sighed deeply, understanding filling his eyes as he looked at his mother with renewed admiration. You're right, as usual. Of course I am, she said with a gentle smile, patting his cheek like she used to when he was small. Now, I believe you have some paperwork to process for my release. The morning sun streamed through the precinct windows, but the atmosphere inside was anything but bright. In the break room, Darren Hayes leaned against the counter, his coffee untouched and growing cold as he held court with several officers gathered around him. The usual morning chatter had been replaced by an undercurrent of tension that seemed to pulse through the room. Can you believe this? Darren's voice dripped with bitterness, his fingers drumming an angry rhythm against his paper cup. 20 years on the force, and I'm stuck pushing papers because the captain's mommy had a bad day. Where's the justice in that? Kyle Rogers stood nearby, nodding eagerly despite the nervous twitch in his hands and the visible sheen of sweat on his forehead. It's not right, he chimed in. Though his voice lacked Darren's conviction, he shifted from foot to foot, unable to meet anyone's eyes directly. As more officers filtered in for their morning coffee, their faces tight with barely concealed resentment, Darren's voice grew louder and more emboldened. We were just doing our jobs, following protocol. But I guess that doesn't matter when you've got family connections, right? Some of us actually had to earn our positions. The whispers spread through the hallways like wildfire, gaining momentum with each retelling. Officers clustered in small groups by the water cooler, in the locker room, and near the dispatch desk, their heads bent together in conspiratorial conversations. Their discussions hushed whenever Marcus walked past, but their eyes followed him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity, some barely bothering to hide their disdain. He never cared about our arrest records before, one officer muttered, crumpling a paper cup in his fist. But his mother gets pulled over, and suddenly we're all under investigation? Talk about abuse of power. Marcus kept his face neutral as he walked through the precinct, shoulders straight despite the weight of countless stares. The manila folder in his hands grew thicker with each passing hour, filled with damning evidence he couldn't ignore. In his office, he methodically reviewed case after case, uncovering a disturbing pattern that made his stomach churn. It wasn't just Darren and Kyle. There were others who had similar complaints buried in their files, carefully hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. The tension in the air grew heavier as the day wore on, thick enough to feel like a physical presence. Officers who usually stopped by his office for casual chats now hurried past his door, averting their eyes and quickening their steps. In meetings, responses were clipped and minimal, delivered with barely concealed hostility. Even the usual friendly banter in the hallways died whenever he approached, replaced by pointed silence. As evening fell, Marcus remained at his desk, surrounded by stacks of files illuminated by his desk lamp, casting long shadows across his troubled features. The evidence was clear. This went beyond a single incident, revealing a systemic problem that couldn't be ignored. But the weight of isolation pressed down on his shoulders as he heard the last of his fellow officers heading home for the day, their footsteps echoing down the empty corridors, leaving him alone with the truth he was uncovering and the heavy responsibility it carried. The precinct buzzed with activity as Evelyn Jackson walked through the front doors, a brown paper bag held carefully in her hands. Her heels clicked softly against the linoleum floor, drawing curious glances from officers who quickly looked away when she met their eyes. She wore a simple navy dress with a cardigan, her silver hair neatly styled, every inch the picture of dignity. "Good morning," she said warmly to the desk sergeant, who mumbled a response and suddenly found his computer screen fascinating. As she made her way toward Marcus's office, Lieutenant Price stood in the hallway, his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral. He watched her progress with sharp eyes that reminded her of a hawk tracking its prey. Marcus looked up from his desk when she entered, his tired face brightening. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "Can't a mother bring lunch to her hardworking son?" Evelyn set the bag on his desk, clearing a space among the scattered files. "You're not eating properly. I can tell." Marcus's shoulders relaxed slightly as the aroma of home-cooked food filled his office. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." Evelyn settled into the chair across from him, her posture perfect but comfortable. "Now tell me what's troubling you." As they shared the meal of fried chicken and cornbread, Marcus's voice dropped low. "Every time I dig deeper, I find more problems. It's not just Darren and Kyle. There's a pattern here going back years. But every time I try to investigate, I hit walls, files gone missing, witnesses suddenly changing their stories." Evelyn dabbed her mouth with a napkin, her eyes sharp despite her gentle tone. "And how are your fellow officers taking it?" "About as well as you'd expect." Marcus sighed, pushing away his half-eaten lunch. "Some won't even look at me anymore." Through the office window, Evelyn noticed Lieutenant Price passing by again, his gaze lingering a moment too long. "Marcus," she said softly, "remember what I taught you about snakes in the grass? Sometimes they're right where you least expect them." Marcus followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "I know, Mom, but I can't stop now, not when I'm finally seeing the whole picture." "Just be careful who you trust," Evelyn said, standing to gather the lunch containers. "Even those who smile the brightest might be hiding the sharpest teeth." On her way out, she passed Lieutenant Price in the hallway. Their eyes met briefly, a silent exchange that carried more weight than words. His face remained impassive, but something cold lurked behind his professional mask. Marcus watched from his office as his mother's straight-backed figure disappeared down the hallway, drawing strength from her quiet confidence in him. Lieutenant Price knocked once before entering Marcus's office, not waiting for a response. His polished shoes gleamed as he stepped inside, closing the door with a soft click. A practiced smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Marcus," he said warmly, settling into the chair across from the desk. "I wanted to commend you on your dedication to fairness in the department. It's admirable, really." Marcus kept his expression neutral, watching as Price leaned back, radiating casual authority. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Is there something specific you needed to discuss?" Price's smile widened slightly. "Actually, yes. I've noticed you've been spending quite a bit of time reviewing old case files and personnel records." He paused, straightening his tie. "While thoroughness is important, I worry that digging too deep into past incidents might not serve our best interests." "Our best interests?" Marcus's voice remained steady, though his jaw tightened. "The department's reputation is delicate," Price continued, his tone shifting to one of fatherly concern. "Stirring up old complaints, revisiting closed cases, it could erode public trust, not to mention the effect on morale." He gestured vaguely around them. "You must have noticed the tension already." Marcus met Price's gaze directly. "What I've noticed, Lieutenant, is a pattern of misconduct that can't be ignored." The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Price's friendly demeanor cracked slightly. "That's a serious accusation, Captain. One that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved, including those responsible for covering it up?" Marcus asked quietly. Price's smile disappeared entirely. "I'd hate to see you damage your career over misguided assumptions. You've built good relationships here. It would be unfortunate to lose them." "I'm more concerned with justice than relationships, Lieutenant." Standing slowly, Price straightened his jacket. "There's no corruption here, Captain. Just dedicated officers doing their best in difficult circumstances." His voice carried an edge of steel. "Be careful, Captain. Sometimes the truth has a way of causing more harm than good." Marcus watched him leave, then pulled out his notebook, recording every detail of their conversation. Price's reaction had told him everything he needed to know. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the precinct's break room as officers gathered around their morning coffee. Steam rose from paper cups, mixing with the tension in the air. Darren Hayes sat at the center table, his chair pushed back, commanding attention from the small crowd around him. "Can you believe this?" Darren's voice carried across the room. 20 years on the force, and suddenly I'm being treated like some rookie who doesn't know procedure. Kyle Rogers stood nearby, fidgeting with his coffee cup. Yeah, it's pretty unfair, he added, his voice lacking Darren's conviction. We were just doing our jobs, Darren continued, gesturing with his coffee. But the moment his mother gets involved, suddenly we're the bad guys? Come on. Several officers nodded, exchanging knowing looks. Officer Thompson, a veteran with graying temples, leaned forward. So you're saying he's only investigating because it was personal? What else could it be? Darren scoffed. We've handled similar situations dozens of times before, but now Captain Jackson's got a grudge, and we're paying the price. Kyle shifted uncomfortably but nodded along. He's definitely trying to clean house for personal reasons. I mean, the timing can't be a coincidence, right? The murmurs grew louder, echoing off the break room walls. I heard he's been pulling old case files, someone added from the back. Exactly. Darren slapped his hand on the table. He's not interested in proper procedure or fairness. This is all about revenge. Heavy footsteps approached the break room door. Marcus Jackson paused just outside, his jaw tightening as he heard his name mentioned. He stood there for a moment, his hands clenched at his sides, listening as Darren's voice carried through the doorway. You know what I think? Darren lowered his voice conspiratorially. I think he's been bending rules left and right to protect his mother. Where's the investigation into that? The accusation hung in the air, met with a mix of agreeing murmurs and uncomfortable silence. Marcus's expression hardened, but he didn't enter the room. Instead, he turned and walked toward his office, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Alone in his office, Marcus sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of files and reports. The morning sun cast long shadows across the papers, but he barely noticed as he buried himself in his work, determined not to let the whispers derail his investigation. The aroma of freshly baked cornbread wafted through Evelyn's kitchen, mingling with the mellow notes of Miles Davis playing softly on her vintage radio. Marcus sat heavily at the worn wooden table, his shoulders slumped under the weight of manila folders spread before him. The evening light filtered through lace curtains, casting gentle shadows across his troubled face. They're turning everyone against me, Mama, Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. Darren's got half the precinct thinking I'm on some personal vendetta. Evelyn moved gracefully around her kitchen, her flowered apron swaying as she prepared 2 cups of chamomile tea. Steam rose from the delicate china cups as she placed one in front of Marcus. Here, drink this, she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. Now tell me everything. Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm cup. The whispers, the looks. Officers who used to trust me now avoid eye contact. And Darren, he shook his head. He's making sure everyone knows this investigation started because of what happened to you. Evelyn listened quietly, her warm brown eyes fixed on her son's face. After a moment, she leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression crossing her features. Let me tell you about something that happened to me back in '65, she began, her voice carrying the weight of memory. I had just started teaching at Jefferson Elementary. First black teacher they ever hired. She paused, stirring her tea. Those first few months, half the staff wouldn't even speak to me. Some parents pulled their children from my class. Marcus looked up, his attention caught by the quiet strength in her voice. One day, the principal called me into his office, said maybe I should consider resigning, that I was disrupting the school's harmony. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. You know what I did? Marcus shook his head. I stayed. Every single day I showed up early, did my job with excellence, and treated everyone with kindness, even those who wouldn't look me in the eye. By the end of that year, I had the highest performing class in the school. She reached across the table, covering Marcus's hand with her own. Sometimes, son, the strongest resistance means you're on the right path. Marcus absorbed her words, feeling something shift inside him. But how did you handle the isolation? By remembering that change isn't about being liked, it's about doing what's right. Those who opposed me weren't just fighting against me. They were fighting against the change I represented. She squeezed his hand. Just like your officers aren't just fighting against you, they're fighting against the mirror you're holding up to their behavior. As darkness settled outside, Marcus began gathering his files. Evelyn stood, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Trust your instincts, baby," she said softly. "But watch your back. Change makers aren't always popular, but they're always necessary." Marcus nodded, drawing strength from his mother's wisdom as he prepared to face whatever challenges awaited him at the precinct. Marcus sat at his desk, methodically sorting through stacks of arrest reports and complaint files. The morning sun cast long shadows across his office as he traced patterns that made his stomach turn. Each document told a story, not just of individual arrests, but of a systemic problem that ran deep through his precinct. "This can't be coincidence," he muttered, marking another troubling entry in Darren's arrest record. The numbers painted a clear picture: excessive force complaints, suspicious charges that never stuck, and a disturbing pattern of targeting specific neighborhoods and demographics. A soft knock at his door drew his attention. Officer Joanna Miller stood in the doorway, her expression concerned but determined. "Captain, I brought those additional files you requested." Marcus gestured her inside, grateful for her discretion. "Close the door, Miller." He spread out several key documents across his desk. "Look at this pattern. Darren and Kyle's arrests. Notice anything unusual?" Joanna leaned in, her brow furrowing as she studied the papers. "These addresses, they're all properties owned by the same 3 developers." She pulled out another file. "And here, these charges were dropped after the businesses were sold at below market rates." "Exactly," Marcus said, his voice low. "And every single one of these cases has Price's signature on it. He's been approving these arrests, making sure they stick just long enough to pressure people into selling." Joanna hesitated, then reached into her folder. "Sir, I've noticed something similar in other cases. I've been keeping track, but..." She glanced nervously at the door. "I wasn't sure who to trust." Marcus reviewed her notes, his jaw tightening. The evidence was mounting, a complex web of harassment, intimidation, and corruption, all leading back to Lieutenant Price and his connections in the community. "I want to help," Joanna said firmly. "Whatever you need, this isn't right." Marcus nodded, grateful for an ally in the increasingly hostile precinct. "We need to be careful. Document everything, but keep it quiet. Price has too many friends in high places." Together, they began organizing the evidence, building a case that would be impossible to ignore. With each new connection they uncovered, the depth of Price's corruption became clearer and more disturbing. Lieutenant Price leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers forming a steeple under his chin as he studied Darren and Kyle. The afternoon sun tried to peek through the closed blinds, casting thin strips of light across his carefully arranged desk. "Gentlemen, I understand you're facing some challenges with Captain Jackson," Price said, his voice smooth as honey but laced with underlying steel. "Rest assured, I've got your backs on this." Darren sat up straighter, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Jackson's been making things difficult since that incident with his mother." Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between Price and Darren. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning. "Here's what we need to do," Price continued, leaning forward. "The captain's investigation is causing unnecessary tension in our precinct. We need to help our fellow officers understand that his zealousness is more about personal vendettas than actual reform." "I've already been talking to some of the guys," Darren offered eagerly. "They're starting to see through his act." Price nodded approvingly. Good, but we need to be subtle about this. Kyle?" He fixed his gaze on the younger officer. "You've been unusually quiet." Kyle swallowed hard. "Are you sure this is the right way to handle this?" "Of course it is," Price assured him, his voice softening. "We're protecting our precinct's integrity. Sometimes that means taking uncomfortable but necessary steps." Throughout the day, Price called officers into his office one by one. With each conversation, he carefully planted doubts about Marcus's motives. "I'm concerned about morale," he would say, or, "It's troubling to see how personal grievances are affecting our department's unity." In the bullpen, Marcus could feel the change in the air. Officers who once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. But as he watched Price emerge from his office after another private meeting, Marcus's resolve only strengthened. The truth was worth the temporary discomfort of isolation. The morning sun filtered through Marcus's office window as Evelyn quietly stepped inside, carrying a brown paper bag that filled the room with the comforting aroma of homemade cornbread and fried chicken. Her navy cardigan was neatly buttoned and her silver hair caught the light as she moved with practiced grace. "You haven't been eating properly," she said simply, placing the bag on his cluttered desk. "I can tell." Marcus looked up from his stack of files, dark circles under his eyes betraying his exhaustion. "Mama, you didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to," she interrupted gently, settling into the chair across from him. "But sometimes a mother knows when her son needs more than just food." Marcus rubbed his temples, the weight of recent events visible in his slumped shoulders. "Price is turning everyone against me. Every time I make progress, he's there, whispering in someone's ear." Evelyn folded her hands in her lap, her calm presence creating a bubble of peace in the tense atmosphere. "When I was teaching at Jefferson High in '65, I faced something similar. The principal didn't want me there, but he couldn't fire me outright. So he tried to break my spirit instead." Marcus leaned forward, his attention caught by the quiet strength in her voice. "He'd spread rumors, turn other teachers against me, make my job harder in little ways," she continued. "But I learned something important. The moment you let them see your anger, they win." "How did you handle it?" "I stayed focused on what mattered. I kept detailed records of everything. I built allies quietly. And most importantly, I never gave him the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure." Her eyes held Marcus's gaze. "You need to think 3 steps ahead, baby. Price is playing checkers, but you need to play chess." Marcus nodded slowly, his mother's words helping to clear the fog of frustration. "I've been letting him get to me, haven't I?" "A little," Evelyn smiled softly. "But that's why I'm here, to remind you who you are and what you're fighting for." As Evelyn rose to leave, she walked through the precinct with her head held high. Price stood near the water cooler, and their eyes met briefly. Evelyn's steady gaze never wavered, her dignity and strength radiating like a quiet force field. Price's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment before he looked away. Marcus watched from his office doorway as his mother departed, her simple visit having restored his sense of purpose. The path ahead was still challenging, but now he could see it more clearly. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the precinct windows as Officer Joanna Miller approached Marcus's office. Her steps were measured, deliberate, and her expression held a mix of determination and caution. She glanced around briefly before knocking on his door. "Come in," Marcus called, looking up from his computer screen. Joanna slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. "Captain Jackson, do you have a moment?" Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Of course, Officer Miller. Please have a seat." As Joanna settled into the chair, Marcus studied her face. He'd always noticed her keen attention to detail and strong moral compass during their previous interactions. Now, seeing her nervous energy, he decided to take a chance. "Officer Miller, I've been reviewing some concerning patterns in our department," he began carefully, sliding a folder across his desk. "I believe you might have noticed similar issues." Joanna's shoulders tensed slightly as she opened the folder. Her eyes widened as she scanned the documents inside. "These arrest reports, I've suspected something wasn't right, but seeing it laid out like this, I need people I can trust," Marcus said quietly. "People who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right." Joanna looked up, her expression hardening with resolve. "Lieutenant Price has been protecting certain officers for years," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen him dismiss valid complaints, especially against Officers Hayes and Rogers, but speaking up," she paused, wringing her hands. "The last officer who questioned his decisions was transferred to traffic duty within a week." Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm but reassuring. "I understand your concerns, but we can't let fear prevent us from doing what's right. I can protect you, Joanna. Your name won't appear in any reports until we're ready to move forward officially." Joanna nodded slowly, her confidence growing. I can help gather evidence. There are conversations in the break room, documents that pass through dispatch. I see a lot that others might miss. That's exactly what I need, Marcus replied. But we have to be careful. Price has eyes everywhere. Together, they outlined a simple but effective plan. Joanna would document any suspicious behavior she witnessed, particularly involving Price and his inner circle. She would pass information to Marcus during routine briefings, making their interactions appear normal to outside observers. As Joanna stood to leave, her posture was straighter, more confident. "Thank you for trusting me with this, Captain," she said quietly. "It's good to know I'm not alone in wanting things to change." Marcus watched her leave, feeling the first real sense of progress since beginning his investigation. In Joanna, he'd found not just an ally, but someone who shared his commitment to justice. The morning sun had barely risen when the first news alert buzzed on Marcus's phone. His stomach dropped as he read the headline: "Police captain accused of corruption, nepotism and power abuse at local precinct." The story spread like wildfire. By the time Marcus arrived at work, reporters had already gathered outside the precinct, their cameras flashing as he made his way through the entrance. Inside, officers whispered and stared, some not even trying to hide their smirks. The article detailed supposed evidence of Marcus manipulating cases to protect his mother and abusing his authority for personal gain. Anonymous sources painted him as a vengeful leader targeting innocent officers out of spite. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he read the full story on his computer. The evidence was clearly fabricated, doctored reports and carefully edited snippets of conversation taken out of context. But the damage was already done. Lieutenant Price appeared in Marcus's doorway, a concerned expression perfectly masking the triumph in his eyes. "Quite a situation we have here, Captain," he said smoothly. "These allegations are troubling." Marcus stood up slowly, his jaw tight. "You orchestrated this, didn't you?" "That's quite an accusation," Price replied, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Perhaps the stress of your position is affecting your judgment. After all, these reports seem quite detailed." From the bullpen, Darren's loud voice carried through the office. "Guess being mommy's boy isn't working out so well for him now." Several officers laughed, and Kyle's nervous chuckle joined them. "You know as well as I do that these allegations are false," Marcus said, stepping closer to Price. Price's smile never wavered. "Do I? The evidence seems compelling. Maybe you should consider taking some time off to clear your head." As Price turned to leave, he paused. "Oh, and Captain? The commissioner will probably want to speak with you about this. Soon." His words hung in the air like poison. Marcus watched him go, noticing Joanna Miller at her desk, her expression grim but determined as she pretended to focus on paperwork. Back in his office, Marcus sank into his chair, the weight of the accusations pressing down on him. He pulled out the files he'd collected on Price's corruption, spreading them across his desk. The truth was here, buried in these documents. He just had to hold on long enough to prove it. The streetlights cast long shadows through Joanna's apartment windows as she hunched over her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of papers. Her usually tidy home had transformed into an investigator's workspace with documents spread across every surface. Coffee cups dotted the landscape of papers, evidence of her long hours reviewing arrest records and financial statements. "This can't be a coincidence," she muttered, drawing another red line connecting two documents. Her eyes widened as patterns emerged from the chaos. Transaction dates matched perfectly with suspicious arrests, and the same names kept appearing in both police reports and banking records. When Marcus arrived, Joanna could barely contain her excitement. "Captain, look at this," she said, gesturing him to the table. "I've traced a series of payments from local business owners to shell companies, all of them linked back to accounts connected to Price." Marcus leaned over the documents, his expression growing more focused with each page. "And these dates?" "Exactly," Joanna nodded. "They align perfectly with arrests made by Darren and Kyle. See these 3 cases? Wealthy business owners had complaints against them dropped right after making large charitable donations to these fake organizations." She pulled out another folder. And here's where it gets interesting. These organizations? They all share the same registered agent, a law firm that represents Price's brother-in-law. Marcus sat down heavily, taking in the implications. This is solid evidence, Joanna. This proves Price isn't just covering up misconduct. He's actively profiting from it. There's more, Joanna said, retrieving another stack of papers. I've identified at least 12 other officers who might have witnessed these transactions or handled related cases. Some of them seemed uncomfortable with what they saw but stayed quiet. Marcus nodded slowly, his determination visible in his squared shoulders. We need to talk to them. If we can get even a few to corroborate these documents. I can start reaching out discreetly, Joanna offered. There are several officers who've expressed concerns about Price in private. They might be willing to come forward if they know they're not alone. As Marcus gathered the evidence into his briefcase, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time since the media attacks began, he could see a clear path forward. Good work, Joanna. Really good work. Joanna smiled, already making notes about which officers to contact first. We're going to expose the truth, Captain. Price can't hide behind his lies forever. The midday sun streamed through the precinct windows as Evelyn Jackson walked through the front doors, her navy blue dress and cardigan as neat and proper as ever. Officers glanced up from their desks, some with surprise, others with barely concealed disdain. But Evelyn paid them no mind, her steps measured and purposeful as she made her way to Lieutenant Price's office. "Lieutenant Price," she called out, her voice carrying the same warmth she used at church socials. "Might I have a moment of your time?" Price looked up from his desk, his practiced smile failing to mask his surprise. "Mrs. Jackson, what an unexpected pleasure. May I?" She gestured to the chair across from his desk. Price nodded, and Evelyn settled herself with dignified grace. "I hope you're having a pleasant morning," she began, smoothing her skirt. "The weather's been quite lovely lately." Price shifted in his seat, clearly unsure of her intentions. "Yes, quite nice. What can I do for you today, Mrs. Jackson?" Evelyn's warm smile remained, but her eyes grew sharp and focused. "You know, Lieutenant, I've lived in this community for over 40 years. I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some not so good." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "I remember a time when I couldn't walk into certain stores without being followed, when I couldn't drive through certain neighborhoods without being stopped, times when people in positions of authority thought they could act with impunity." Price's jaw tightened slightly. "Mrs. Jackson, I'm not sure I understand." "Oh, I think you do," Evelyn interrupted, her voice still gentle but firm. "You see, injustice has a familiar smell to it, and lately, this precinct has been reeking of it." Price leaned back, his facade of politeness cracking. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, Lieutenant, it's an observation." Evelyn's gaze never wavered. "And I've observed quite a lot lately, more than you might think." She stood up slowly, straightening her cardigan. "The truth has a way of catching up with us, Lieutenant. You might want to prepare for what's coming." Price watched, visibly unsettled, as Evelyn walked to the door. As she left the precinct, Marcus observed from down the hall, pride swelling in his chest at his mother's quiet strength and unwavering courage. The precinct's break room was eerily quiet at this late hour, with only the soft hum of the vending machine and muted whispers breaking the silence. Joanna Miller sat at a corner table, pretending to review paperwork while her phone recorded nearby, carefully hidden beneath some files. Darren Hayes leaned forward, his voice low but clear enough for the recording. "Price has our backs. He's been running this system for years and nobody's caught on." Kyle Rogers fidgeted with his coffee cup, glancing nervously at the door. "But what if someone starts asking questions about those arrest reports? The ones we, made up?" Darren snorted. "That's the beauty of it. Price signs off on everything. Makes it all official looking. Plus those rich folks he works with, they're happy to grease the wheels." Kyle's voice trembled. "I don't know, man. The captain's been digging deep lately. What if he finds something? Jackson? Darren scoffed, but there was an edge of worry in his voice. Price will handle him, just like he's handled everyone else who's gotten too nosy. Joanna kept her eyes down, her heart racing as she captured every word. The evidence was damning. Explicit confirmation of falsified reports, Price's involvement, and the broader conspiracy. Later that evening, in Marcus's office, Joanna played the recording. Marcus listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. When he called in Darren and Kyle, their swagger vanished as soon as they heard their own voices through the speakers. "I want to make one thing clear," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't going away. The only question is whether you'll go down with Price or help me expose the truth." Darren's face had lost all color. Kyle looked like he might be sick. "We'll talk," Darren said quickly, his earlier bravado gone. "About everything. Price's whole operation." Kyle nodded frantically. "We'll tell you whatever you need to know, Captain. Just, please. We made mistakes, but we want to make it right." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying them both. "Your cooperation will be noted, but there will still be consequences. Are we clear?" Both officers nodded, defeated but relieved to have a way out. As Marcus began documenting their statements, he felt the weight of months of investigation finally bearing fruit. The evidence was undeniable now. Recordings, testimonies, and a clear paper trail leading straight to Price's door. The early morning sun cast long shadows through Marcus's office blinds as he methodically arranged the evidence against Price. Stacks of files, witness statements, and financial records covered his desk, each piece carefully labeled and annotated. The recording device containing Darren and Kyle's confession sat at the center, like a small but powerful weapon. Joanna stood by the window, her posture alert as she watched officers arriving for their morning shift. "The witness statements are organized by date," she said, gesturing to a thick manila folder. "I've highlighted the key passages that corroborate the financial trail." Marcus nodded, his expression grave but determined. "Thank you, Joanna. Your help has been invaluable." Darren and Kyle entered the office, both looking uncomfortable in their civilian clothes. Kyle's hands trembled slightly as he took a seat, while Darren tried to maintain his usual swagger but couldn't quite manage it. "Listen carefully," Marcus said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Your testimony is crucial. The Oversight Committee needs to hear directly from officers involved in Price's operation. I know this isn't easy, but it's the right thing to do." Kyle swallowed hard. What if Price finds out before the hearing? He's got connections everywhere. "He's right," Darren added, his usual bravado completely gone. "Price won't go down without a fight." "You'll be protected," Marcus assured them. "The mayor's office has already guaranteed your safety in exchange for your cooperation." After briefing Darren and Kyle, Marcus made his way to City Hall. The meeting with the mayor's staff was brief but productive. They scheduled an emergency oversight committee hearing for the following morning, understanding the urgency of addressing the corruption before Price could cover his tracks. Back at the precinct, tension crackled through the air like static electricity. Officers whispered in corners, quickly falling silent when others passed by. Price stalked the hallways, his calculated charm replaced by barely concealed anxiety, as he questioned his loyal followers about Marcus's activities. As Marcus gathered his materials to leave for the meeting, a familiar figure appeared in his doorway. Evelyn stood there, her presence as steady and comforting as always. She crossed the room and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Stay the course, son," she said softly. "The truth has its own power." Marcus covered her hand with his own, drawing strength from her quiet confidence. With renewed resolve, he picked up his briefcase and headed for the door, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Lieutenant Price paced in his office, sunlight filtering through the half-closed blinds as he faced his assembled officers. His usual polished demeanor showed cracks of desperation, evident in the slight tremor of his hands and the sheen of sweat on his forehead. "This ends today," Price declared, his voice carrying an edge of steel. "Marcus Jackson thinks he can tear down everything we've built, everything we've worked for." His gaze settled on Darren and Kyle, who who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Sir," Darren started, trying to maintain his composure. "Maybe we should—" "Should what?" Price cut him off sharply. "Let him destroy us? Let me be clear about what happens if you side with him." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Your careers won't be the only things at risk. Remember who your real friends are." Kyle's face paled, but he exchanged a subtle glance with Darren. Despite their fear, both officers remained silent, their commitment to Marcus's cause holding firm. Price moved to his desk and pulled out a thick folder. "I've arranged for some information to reach the press," he said, a cold smile playing at his lips. "Let's see how the public reacts when they learn about Marcus's creative interpretation of justice." Within hours, news alerts buzzed across phones throughout the precinct. Headlines screamed about alleged corruption and abuse of power by Captain Marcus Jackson. The story painted him as a man willing to bend rules and fabricate evidence to protect his mother, complete with doctored documents that seemed to support the claims. Marcus sat in his office, staring at the breaking news on his computer screen. His hands clenched into fists as he read the false allegations. The timing wasn't coincidental. Price had orchestrated this to undermine his credibility just before the Oversight Committee meeting. Taking a deep breath, Marcus straightened his tie and gathered his files. He wouldn't let Price's desperate tactics derail justice. The evidence was solid, the witness testimonies were real, and the truth would speak for itself. The Oversight Committee's meeting room felt charged with tension as Marcus approached the building. Committee members sat behind their long table, their expressions neutral but watchful. Marcus squared his shoulders, ready to present his case despite the cloud of suspicion Price had created. In the precinct parking lot, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows as a crowd of reporters jostled for position, microphones extended and cameras rolling. Evelyn Jackson stood before them, her silver hair catching the sunlight, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying herself with quiet dignity. "I'd like to share something with you all," she began, her voice clear and steady. The reporters fell silent, drawn in by her commanding presence. "Last week I was having breakfast at Miller's Diner, just like I do every Thursday morning. By the end of that morning I found myself handcuffed and humiliated, simply for being in what some officers considered the wrong neighborhood." The cameras clicked rapidly as Evelyn described her arrest in detail, her calm demeanor making the injustice of the situation even more striking. "But this isn't about me," she continued. "This is about a pattern of behavior that my son, Captain Marcus Jackson, has been working tirelessly to address." Her eyes swept across the gathered crowd, making direct contact with several reporters. "My son has always stood for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. When he was just a boy, I watched him stand up to bullies twice his size because they were picking on a smaller child. That's who Marcus is, someone who fights for others, regardless of the personal cost." Community members who had gathered began nodding in agreement. Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the local bakery, stepped forward to share her own story of how Marcus had helped her family when they faced harassment. Others followed, each account adding weight to Evelyn's words. "The accusations against my son aren't just false. They're a desperate attempt to silence someone who's finally shining a light on long-hidden wrongs," Evelyn stated firmly. "Marcus could have chosen an easier path. He could have looked the other way. Instead, he chose to stand up for what's right just like he did as a child." The reporters' questions shifted from accusatory to supportive, their tone reflecting the changing narrative. Local residents began sharing their stories on social media. "Stand with Captain Jackson" trending within hours. In the Oversight Committee's waiting room, Marcus watched his mother's speech on a wall-mounted television, his throat tight with emotion. His hands, which had been nervously shuffling papers, grew still as he listened to her words of support and the community's response. The conference room at City Hall buzzed with tension as the Oversight Committee members settled into their high-backed chairs. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the polished wooden table where stacks of documents lay before each committee member. Marcus Jackson stood at the podium, his Navy uniform crisp and neat, radiating quiet confidence despite the weight of the moment. "Committee members, what I'm about to present reveals a pattern of systematic corruption within our precinct," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. He methodically laid out the evidence, starting with the financial records Joanna had uncovered. Lieutenant Price sat at the far end of the table, his usual smug demeanor showing cracks as Marcus played the recording of Darren and Kyle's late-night conversation. The committee members leaned forward, their expressions growing more serious with each revelation. When Darren and Kyle took the stand, their testimony was halting but honest. "Lieutenant Price instructed us to target specific individuals," Darren admitted, avoiding Price's glare. "He promised protection in exchange for our cooperation." Kyle nodded, his hands fidgeting. "We fabricated charges under his direction. The arrests always benefited the same group of people." Joanna's testimony followed, her voice unwavering as she described the pattern of misconduct she'd witnessed. "I documented numerous instances where Lieutenant Price approved questionable arrests and buried legitimate complaints." Price shot to his feet, his face flushed. "This is nothing but a personal vendetta," he snapped. "Captain Jackson is manipulating these officers, coercing them to lie about me because of what happened with his mother." The committee chairman raised his hand for silence. "Lieutenant Price, you'll have your chance to respond formally to these allegations." As the evidence mounted, Price's protests grew more desperate, but the committee's skeptical glances told their own story. The chairman finally cleared his throat. "We will need time to review all this information thoroughly. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. with our decision." Marcus gathered his materials, his heart pounding but his expression remaining professional. The weight of months of investigation hung in the air as he left the conference room, knowing the next 24 hours would feel endless. The tension in the precinct was electric as officers huddled around the break room television. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across anxious faces. Marcus stood slightly apart from the group, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the screen intently. Lieutenant Price leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, a hint of sweat visible on his forehead, despite his attempt to maintain his usual confident demeanor. The room fell silent as the Oversight Committee chairperson appeared on screen. "After careful review of the substantial evidence presented," the chairperson announced, her voice clear and firm, "this committee has determined that Lieutenant Raymond Price be immediately suspended from duty pending further investigation. We are recommending criminal charges based on the compelling documentation of corruption and abuse of power." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Some officers exchanged worried glances, while others nodded in grim satisfaction. "Furthermore," the chairperson continued, "we find the allegations against Captain Marcus Jackson to be entirely without merit. He is cleared of all accusations and commended for his dedication to maintaining departmental integrity." Two uniformed officers approached Price, handcuffs at the ready, his face twisted with barely contained rage as they secured his wrists. "This isn't over, Jackson," he spat as they led him toward the exit. His footsteps echoed through the suddenly quiet hallway. Darren and Kyle stood awkwardly to the side, their faces pale. Though they had avoided arrest through their cooperation, the weight of their actions showed clearly in their downcast eyes and slumped shoulders. Marcus stepped to the center of the room, clearing his throat. The officers turned to face him, their expressions a mix of respect, uncertainty, and shame. "Today marks a turning point," Marcus said, his voice steady and determined. "We have a chance to rebuild this department on a foundation of trust and integrity. What happened here wasn't just about one person's corruption, it was about a system that allowed that corruption to flourish. Each of us has a responsibility to do better, to be better." The door opened quietly and Evelyn walked in, her presence commanding attention without a word. She watched as Marcus finished addressing his officers, pride evident in her eyes. As the officers began to disperse, Marcus retreated to his office. He sank into his chair, exhaling slowly as the events of the morning settled over him. A soft knock preceded Evelyn's entrance. She stood before his desk, offering him a gentle smile. "This is just the beginning," she said simply, her words carrying both encouragement and reminder of the work still ahead. The precinct's break room was unusually quiet that morning. The coffee maker hummed softly in the corner, and sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Darren Hayes shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his usual confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Beside him, Kyle Rogers stood with his hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. Evelyn Jackson sat at one of the small tables, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Her posture was relaxed but dignified, her expression neutral as she watched the two officers approach. "Mrs. Jackson," Darren began, his voice rougher than usual. We need to talk to you." He glanced at Kyle, who nodded quickly, his face pale. Evelyn gestured to the empty chairs across from her. "Please, sit down." The officers lowered themselves into the chairs, the metal legs scraping against the floor. Darren cleared his throat twice before speaking again. "What we did to you that day, it was wrong. I let my prejudices control my actions. I convinced myself I was just doing my job, but..." He paused, running a hand over his face. "I was being a bully, plain and simple." Kyle leaned forward slightly. "We're both really sorry, Mrs. Jackson. What we did caused so much pain, not just to you, but to the whole department. We should have known better." Evelyn took a slow sip of her tea, letting the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "Thank you for your apology," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But you understand that words alone don't erase what happened." Both officers nodded, and Darren's shoulders slumped. "Yes, ma'am." "Real change," Evelyn continued, "comes from consistent actions over time. It means examining your biases every single day. It means speaking up when you see others making the same mistakes you did." Kyle wiped at his eyes quickly. "How can we make things right?" "By doing better," Evelyn replied simply. "By remembering this moment every time you put on that uniform. By treating every person you encounter with the respect and dignity they deserve." Darren met her eyes for the first time. "I promise you, Mrs. Jackson, I'm going to change. No more excuses, no more looking the other way." "Me too," Kyle added softly. "We want to be part of the solution now." The officers stood, understanding their time with Evelyn was drawing to a close. As they walked toward the door, Marcus entered the break room. He paused, watching Darren and Kyle exit with their heads bowed. "How did it go?" he asked his mother, concern evident in his voice. Evelyn set down her teacup and looked up at her son. "Time will tell." The precinct's main conference room buzzed with tension as officers filed in, taking their seats in neat rows. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow on faces that ranged from openly hostile to cautiously interested. Marcus Jackson stood at the podium, his uniform crisp and his posture straight, exuding quiet authority. "Good morning," Marcus began, his voice clear and steady. "We're here today to discuss the future of our precinct. Recent events have shown us that change isn't just necessary, it's crucial for our survival as a department." He clicked through his presentation, revealing detailed charts and bullet points. "First, we're implementing mandatory bias training for all officers, regardless of rank or years of service. This isn't about pointing fingers, it's about acknowledging that we all have room to grow." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One veteran officer near the back crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "Additionally," Marcus continued, "we're establishing an independent review board for misconduct allegations. This board will include community members and law enforcement professionals, ensuring fair and thorough investigations." Officer Thompson raised his hand. "Captain, with all due respect, won't this just tie our hands? We need to be able to do our jobs without looking over our shoulders." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the concern. "I understand your worry, Officer Thompson. But transparency doesn't hinder good police work, it validates it. When we have nothing to hide, we have nothing to fear from oversight." Joanna Miller stood up from her seat in the second row. "If I may, Captain?" At Marcus's nod, she turned to face her fellow officers. "I've volunteered to head up our new community engagement program. We're not just enforcing the law, we're part of this community. These changes will help us serve it better." Her words seemed to resonate with some of the younger officers who nodded in agreement. Even a few veteran officers appeared thoughtful. Marcus outlined more initiatives: body camera protocols, de-escalation training, regular community feedback sessions. Each point was met with a mix of reactions, some officers taking notes, others exchanging skeptical glances. From her position near the door, Evelyn watched quietly, her eyes filled with pride as her son navigated the challenging waters of change with grace and determination. Mayor Thomas Carter's office gleamed with polished wood and brass fixtures, sunlight streaming through tall windows. His secretary's surprised expression said it all when Evelyn Jackson walked in, requesting an impromptu meeting. "Mrs. Jackson," the mayor said, rising from behind his desk, "this is unexpected." Despite his initial hesitation, he gestured to a chair. "Please have a seat." Evelyn settled into the leather chair with her characteristic grace. "Thank you for seeing me, Mayor Carter. I believe we need to discuss the future of our police department." "I've been following recent events closely," Carter admitted, his fingers drumming lightly on his desk. "Your son has certainly stirred things up." "Change often does that," Evelyn replied with a gentle smile. She leaned forward slightly. "But what happened to me wasn't just about one incident or a few bad officers. It's about a system that needs rebuilding from the ground up." She shared her story, her voice steady and clear. The mayor's expression shifted from diplomatic politeness to genuine concern as she described not just her own experience, but similar stories from countless others in the community. "The solutions are there," Evelyn continued, pulling out a carefully prepared document. "We need comprehensive training programs, not just one-day seminars, but ongoing education, independent oversight committees with real power, community engagement initiatives that build trust, not just photo opportunities." Mayor Carter picked up the document, scanning its contents. "These are detailed proposals, Mrs. Jackson, and expensive ones." "Less expensive than lawsuits, lost trust, and damaged lives," Evelyn countered smoothly. "My son is trying to create real change, Mayor Carter, but he needs institutional support to make it last." The mayor stood, walking to his window. After a moment, he turned back to Evelyn. "You make compelling points. I can commit to prioritizing these initiatives in next year's budget, and I'll work with Captain Jackson to implement these changes." "Thank you," Evelyn said, rising from her chair. "That's all I needed to hear." Outside the office, Evelyn pulled out her phone and called Marcus. Her voice was warm as she delivered her message. "You've got more allies than you think. Keep going." Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing the incident report with a furrowed brow. The morning sun cast long shadows across the scattered papers detailing a confrontation between Officer Peterson and a teenage suspect. The body cam footage played on his computer screen, showing a disturbing sequence of events that didn't match the written account. "Captain," Joanna called from the doorway, "the witnesses are here for their interviews." Marcus nodded, pausing the video. "Let's use conference room B, more privacy there." He gathered his materials, noting how the precinct had grown quieter since news of the incident broke. The leadership team assembled quickly, sergeants and lieutenants filling the conference room with tense energy. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his voice steady and clear. "We need to handle this by the book," he said, laying out photos from the scene. "The public trust is fragile, and this incident has already made headlines. I want a thorough investigation. No corners cut, no assumptions made." Officer Peterson sat stiffly in his chair during the interview, arms crossed defensively. "I followed protocol," he insisted, avoiding eye contact. The suspect was resisting. "The footage shows something different," Marcus replied calmly, rewinding the video. "Can you explain this discrepancy?" Peterson's face reddened. "You weren't there. You don't know how it felt in the moment." Marcus and Joanna spent hours interviewing witnesses, cross-referencing statements with physical evidence and video footage. The truth emerged clearly. Peterson had escalated the situation unnecessarily and used excessive force. After completing the investigation, Marcus called Peterson into his office. "Based on the evidence, I'm issuing a 30-day suspension without pay," he said firmly. "You'll also need to complete additional de-escalation training before returning to active duty." Word spread quickly through the precinct. Some officers muttered about weak leadership, while others nodded in approval at the fair but firm handling of the situation. At the press conference, Marcus stood before the microphones, Joanna a supportive presence beside him. Local news cameras rolled as he detailed the investigation's findings and the disciplinary actions taken. Transparency and accountability aren't just words, he stated clearly. They're the foundation of trust between law enforcement and the community we serve. We will continue to hold ourselves to the highest standards. The precinct lobby buzzed with morning activity as Evelyn pushed through the glass doors, her familiar cardigan wrapped snugly around her shoulders. Officer Chen looked up from the front desk, offering a genuine smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Jackson. The captain's expecting you." "Thank you, dear," Evelyn replied, noting how different this welcome felt from her first encounter here. As she walked through the hallway, she observed officers greeting citizens with patience and respect. The harsh edge that once defined the precinct had softened into something more humane. Officer Miller, Joanna, passed by with a stack of files, pausing to exchange warm greetings. "Those community outreach programs you suggested are making a real difference, Mrs. Jackson," she said. "The feedback has been incredible." Evelyn nodded appreciatively, continuing toward Marcus's office. Through the glass walls, she could see various notices posted, updated conduct policies, community meeting schedules, and contact information for the newly established Civilian Oversight Board. Marcus stood when she entered, coming around his desk to embrace her. "Mom, perfect timing. I was just reviewing the quarterly reports." They settled into the comfortable chairs by his window, sunlight warming the space between them. "You know," Marcus began, his voice soft with gratitude, "I couldn't have done any of this without you. Your strength through everything. It showed me what real leadership looks like." Evelyn reached across to pat his hand. "You always had it in you, baby. Sometimes we just need a little push to find our courage." They shared a knowing laugh, remembering the tension of those early confrontations. "Remember when Lieutenant Price thought he could intimidate you?" Marcus shook his head, smiling. "He had no idea who he was dealing with." "Well," Evelyn chuckled, "your mama didn't raise a coward, and neither did I raise one." As Evelyn prepared to leave, she paused in the lobby, turning to take in the scene one final time. Officers moved purposefully through their duties, the atmosphere professional, yet welcoming. The building itself seemed transformed, no longer a symbol of intimidation, but one of community service and protection. She felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a single moment of standing firm in the face of injustice. The precinct had become what it always should have been, a place of justice and dignity for all. Marcus sat in his dimly lit office, the gentle hum of the heating system providing a quiet backdrop as he reviewed the latest departmental reports. The statistics showed a marked improvement in community relations and officer conduct, concrete evidence that their reforms were taking root. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. Joanna Miller stood in the doorway, her usual determined expression softened by a slight smile. "Got a minute, Captain?" "Of course," Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I was just going through these quarterly reports." "Good news, I hope?" Joanna settled into the chair, placing a folder on his desk. "Better than I expected," Marcus admitted, running his hand over the smooth surface of the report. "Civilian complaints are down 40%. Response times have improved. Even our internal surveys show officer job satisfaction is up. The younger officers especially," Joanna added, leaning forward. "Just yesterday, Officer Rodriguez told me how much he appreciates the new mentorship program. Said it's helping him understand what real community policing looks like." Marcus nodded, thinking back to the tumultuous months following Price's removal. "There were moments I wasn't sure we'd make it this far," he confessed, his voice quiet. "Especially during those first few weeks when half the department wouldn't even look me in the eye. But you didn't back down," Joanna reminded him. "That meant something to people. Still does." She opened her folder and pulled out a handwritten note. "Actually, that's partly why I stopped by. Officer Chen asked me to share this with you. It's about that domestic violence call she handled last week." Marcus read the note, his expression softening. Chen had written about how she'd used the de-escalation techniques from their new training program, successfully resolving a potentially volatile situation without force. She credited Marcus's emphasis on patience and empathy for helping her handle the situation differently than she might have in the past. "This is what real change looks like," Joanna said softly. "One officer, one interaction at a time. You showed us it was possible, Captain. You gave us something to believe in." Marcus set the note down carefully, touched by the sincerity in both Chen's words and Joanna's voice. "We still have a long way to go," he said. "But we're moving in the right direction," Joanna finished, standing up. "That's what matters." As Joanna left his office, Marcus gathered his things and switched off his desk lamp. He stood in the quiet hallway for a moment, taking in the peaceful stillness of the precinct at night. The building felt different now, not just a workplace, but a place of genuine service and integrity. The morning sunlight streamed through Evelyn's kitchen windows, casting warm patterns across her well-worn wooden table. The rich aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the subtle scent of the potted herbs she kept on the windowsill. Marcus sat at his usual spot, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug as Evelyn settled into the chair across from him. "How are things at the precinct?" Evelyn asked, her gentle voice carrying its familiar mix of concern and curiosity. Marcus smiled, taking a sip of coffee before responding. "Better than I could have hoped, Mom. The new training programs are making a real difference. Even some of the officers who were skeptical at first are coming around." "Tell me more," Evelyn encouraged, leaning forward slightly. "Remember Officer Chen? Last week she stopped a situation from escalating by using the de-escalation techniques we've been practicing. She said it reminded her of how you handled things that day, with dignity and calm." Evelyn chuckled softly. "That day feels like a lifetime ago now, doesn't it?" "Sometimes," Marcus agreed, his expression growing thoughtful. "When I think about Price and everything that happened, it's hard to believe we made it through all that." "But we did," Evelyn reminded him, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "And look at what's grown from it. Real change, Marcus. The kind that lasts." They shared a knowing look, remembering the tense days of the investigation, the stress of the Oversight Committee hearing, and the ultimate vindication when the truth came to light. "Remember when Darren and Kyle came to apologize?" Marcus asked, shaking his head with a slight smile. "Those two," Evelyn said, her tone more amused than bitter. "Sometimes the hardest lessons make the strongest impact. They needed that wake-up call." "We all did, in different ways," Marcus admitted. "I learned more about leadership in those few weeks than I had in years of training." Evelyn nodded, refilling their coffee cups. "That's because real leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about staying true to what's right, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." As the morning light grew stronger, Marcus glanced at his watch. Standing up, he gathered his things, but Evelyn stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. She pulled him into a warm embrace, her voice soft but firm. "I'm proud of you, son. So proud of the man you've become." Marcus hugged her back, feeling the familiar comfort of his mother's unconditional support. As he headed toward his car, he felt lighter, stronger, ready to face another day of building the department they'd all fought so hard to create. The precinct's community room buzzed with anticipation. Gone were the stark institutional walls, now decorated with photographs showcasing positive interactions between officers and community members. Round tables dotted the space, each adorned with simple centerpieces of blue and white flowers. Marcus stood at the podium, his uniform crisp and his expression composed. The crowd, a mix of officers in dress blues, community leaders in formal attire, and city officials, settled into attentive silence. 6 months ago, Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. This department faced a critical moment. We could either continue down a path that damaged community trust, or we could choose transformation. He paused, scanning the faces before him. Thanks to dedicated officers like Joanna Miller and community members who held us accountable, we chose change. Joanna approached the podium next, her usual quiet confidence amplified by pride in their shared accomplishments. When Captain Jackson first outlined his vision for reform, many thought it was impossible, she said, earning knowing chuckles from the audience. But what we've achieved, mandatory bias training, community oversight boards, transparent disciplinary procedures, proves that change is possible when leadership and integrity align. In the front row, Darren and Kyle sat straight-backed and attentive. Both wore their uniforms with a new sense of purpose, having spent recent months mentoring rookie officers on ethical policing practices. Our journey toward reform, Darren shared when it was his turn to speak, began with acknowledging our mistakes. Officer Rogers and I now teach new recruits about the importance of checking our biases and treating every community member with respect. From her seat near the back of the room, Evelyn watched the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. Her eyes met Marcus's briefly across the crowded room, conveying volumes of pride and understanding without a word being spoken. The event concluded with a standing ovation, officers and community members mingling freely, sharing stories and hopes for continued progress. As the crowd began to thin, Evelyn slipped out quietly, leaving Marcus surrounded by well-wishers and colleagues. Outside, Marcus stood watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The weight of his badge felt different now, not lighter perhaps, but more balanced. More right. If you enjoyed the story of Evelyn, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.